Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
Herzlich willkommen, liebe Zuseher und Zuseherinnen. Es ist mir eine Freude, Sie wieder bei unserem Mena-Watch Talk begrüßen zu können. Unser heutiger Gast ist Michael Kotler-Wunsch. Sie ist seit dem Herbst 2023 Israels Sonderbeauftragte für die Bekämpfung des Antisemitismus. Davor war die studierte Juristin eine Zeit lang im israelischen Justizministerium tätig, beziehungsweise an kanadischen und israelischen Universitäten, und ungefähr ein Jahr lang war sie auch Abgeordnete der Knesset für die Partei Blau-Weiß. Mrs. Kotler-Wunsch, welcome to Vienna. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. You took up your position as Special Envoy for Combating Antisemitism at the end of September 2023. At the time, a newspaper report quoted you as saying that you actually felt like crying about, in the year 2023, that it was still necessary to appoint a Special Envoy for Combating Antisemitism. You said, I quote, "It's a testament to the rise of and mainstreaming of anti-Semitism." So what did you think at the time about what lay ahead of you? What did you consider to be your biggest challenge in September 2023?
So thank you for, first of all, the opportunity to engage and actually to reflect on that question. And I remember that interview, actually, and I had spoken not only about the fact that Israel needed a special envoy for combating anti-Semitism, but that I am one of about 35 special envoys for combating anti-Semitism around the world, the United States, many countries in Europe and South America. And the realization that in 2023, September of 2023, we would need this role as a testament to the increase or the steady rise in anti-Semitism, with a prediction that its mainstreaming was going to endanger democracies. And the understanding then, from my perspective as an international law and human rights expert, as a former legislator, having engaged in the issues including of anti-Semitism online and the university spaces and the international institutions, that my work as Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism, quite a new position for the State of Israel, would demand to create a national strategy, if you will, for combating anti-Semitism, as many countries have. And that in Israel's case, as it is the nation state of the Jewish people, it must have an international component of combating anti-Semitism with an international strategy. That was my goal in September of 2023. And then, of course, October the 7th happened.
Then, of course, October the 7th happened, and Hamas attacked Israel and murdered about 1,200 Israelis, committed unspeakable crimes, and abducted over about 250 people as hostages to the Gaza Strip, of course. And not only that, the bloody terrorist attack was only the prelude to a worldwide wave of anti-Semitism. In an interview with CNN, you spoke of a tsunami of anti-Semitism after October the 7th. Could you have imagined that on October 7, 2023?
I say with devastation, again. Not only could I have imagined it, but the anticipated tsunami that actually erupted in the aftermath, or in response, if you will, to the October 7th massacre, was the reason that I got on my first plane after October the 7th, about 10 days after October the 7th, for my first emergency trip, I'll call it, in what has been 18 months of emergency trips, essentially, since October the 7th. And the devastating piece, of course, intersects with precisely what it was that I was able to track in terms of the hijacking and weaponization of international law and its institutions and its principles to be applied selectively on the Jew among nations, that is the State of Israel, through the case and cause. And this is devastating because you said that massacre, of course, not only bludgeoned to death and burned alive and raped and massacred, but also abducted 251 human beings, of which 58 remain in Hamas terror hell, except that one of the 58 is actually deceased soldier Hadar Golden, who for 10.5 years I've built the case and cause together with his family to demand that this standing violation of international law be addressed by the international community, by the UN and its institutions, by the countries mandated to uphold, promote, and protect the international rules-based order equally and consistently, by the human rights organizations that have been silent to a standing violation of international law and morality, not only in the captivity of deceased soldier Hadar Goldin for more than 10.5 years, but alongside him was another deceased soldier, Oron Shaul, and 2 Israeli civilians, Avera Mengistu and Isham Asayed, who both wandered into Gaza and actually were released in one of these perverse ceremonies that Hamas held with the Red Cross standing next to it. Well, we filed complaints against that Red Cross that did not visit Hisham Asayed or Avera Mengistu in the 9.5 years that they were held captives by the same Hamas in the same Gaza. And so the eruption or the tsunami of anti-Semitism around the world in response to the worst attack of Jews since the Holocaust and the unleashing of a multi-front war that has ensued since on 7 fronts, as we know, by the same Islamic Republic of Iran and all of its proxies, Hamas being one of them. Houthis, and up until this morning, in the last 24 hours, have fired 3 ballistic missiles at millions of Israeli civilians. A double war crime, a violation of international law that actually underscores precisely what it was that you can maybe hear the urgency in my voice in understanding that the response to the October 7th massacre and the war that it unleashed openly intend to annihilate the state of Israel and murder Jews, as the Hamas charter, like Mein Kampf, openly declares its intent to do. It's the response that alarmed me. The response of international law, of the institutions, the countries, the organizations mandated and trusted to uphold, promote, and protect. And it's the responses to that massacre and the war that has raged since. And I'll say responses of silence, me too, unless you're a Jew, responses of denial that began on October the 7th, even while its barbaric savages were live streaming their atrocities. Denial of October the 7th began. Responses of justification, so, feminists, radical feminists like Judith Butler, but feminists nonetheless, expressing the understanding that she has of rape as armed resistance, and responses of the attack of Jews and Zionists, or anyone who believes in Israel's very right to exist, which is what October the 7th challenged, their attack around the world in every city that I have landed: Toronto, Washington, Boston, Chicago, London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna. Every city that we have seen intersect in protests that have been legitimizing or mainstreaming this modern strain of anti-Semitism that fueled the October 7th massacre and fuels those responses to it.
One of the institutions at the very forefront of defaming Israel in the aftermath of October 7th, of course, were the various institutions within the umbrella of the United Nations. I saw a video of you giving a speech at the Security Council at the United Nations in New York. How was the mood there at the headquarters of the United Nations? How were the reactions to your speech in the Security Council? So
it was not at the Security Council. It was a special hearing that we held 1 month after October the 7th, actually, 1 month later. A hearing that I actually called Never Again Is Now, in which the most important impact that it made is to expose the systematic hijacking, appropriation, and weaponization of the UN itself, as you said, and its agencies, and its principles, and its mechanisms to demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to the Jew among the nations, that is the State of Israel. The understanding that in this post-World War II creation of an international rules-based order, it's the UN itself that was mandated to uphold, promote, and protect that international rules-based order. And as we know, if you apply any rule selectively, any principle selectively, it's not worth the paper it's written on. And the sort of underscoring of what the UN has enabled with silence, but also with actual action. And I begin the unconventional war, I'll call it for public opinion or for hearts and minds, in the 1975 UN resolution of Zionism is racism. The understanding that we're about to mark 50 years to that resolution passed in the UN, Soviet propaganda passed in the UN, alive and well on 2025 university campuses, online spaces, frankly on the streets, and every protest in which I am actually coming to a campus to speak about anti-Semitism. It is anti-Zionism that presents itself. Zionism is racism is that foundation that was laid and the first opening blood libel or opening shot of this unconventional war for public opinion, of which the tsunami of anti-Semitism could have been predicted. If I had to then demarcate the next blood libel, the next sort of escalation, it is the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism, turned into an anti-Semitic hate fest in which those that were present, many human rights organizations and international law scholars, understood deeply that their life's work, human rights, international law, has been hijacked and weaponized. And actually, I'll come back to that because it led to a very important process of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And finally, the third most Orwellian inversion of fact and of law in the UN itself, as you have said, in the aftermath of the October 7th massacre that included atrocities the likes of which the Jewish people have not suffered since the Holocaust, but have not been seen in modern times and somehow under some sort of a progressive ideology, were received with, as I said, the responses of silence, denial, justification, and attack of Jews or the supporters of Israel, including in the UN institutions with what I would call the hijacking and appropriation of genocide, a term that we should shudder when we utter. As we know, a term coined by Raphael Lemkin, whose entire family was annihilated in the Holocaust, in order to not only be able to name the atrocities that were unspeakable horrors and had no term alongside Lauterpacht with crimes against humanity, but in fact were the basis for the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And even before none other than South Africa accused Israel in none other than the International Court of Justice of the crime of genocide, changing the definition of genocide, protests in the streets and articles in student newspapers and online discourse accuse the state of Israel of genocide before it even began to respond or even understand what it was that happened on October the 7th. So it is, in fact, in that institution, and I think that that hearing was by far the most, I'd say, unequal, or I'll say it differently, the recipients of my criticism in the UN did not engage with what it was that I was sounding the alarms for. But in my words there, October the 7th was the Kristallnacht of our times. And the question was what we would do after the Kristallnacht of our times. And in this 19-month period, we have seen only an escalation of the failure of the international rules-based order, of the institutions, of the mechanisms, of the human rights infrastructure that includes organizations like Amnesty, literally changing the definition of genocide in order to be able to parrot the blood libel against the state of Israel, even as it is defending itself from openly declared genocidal intent to annihilate it on 7 fronts. I would say that what the purpose of that hearing was to expose that this is what I call the 8th front, an 8th front that has not stopped raging, that began with a 50-year-ago process, with a 21-year Israel's an apartheid state, academic institution adoption of the demonization, delegitimization, and application of double standards towards the Jew among the nations, and that completed, if you will, this dangerous systematic appropriation and hijacking of principles with that of genocide, with hijacking the Holocaust itself to accuse the state of Israel of the most heinous atrocities perpetrated against the Jewish people. Yeah, it was quite a revealing, I think, discussion for me in the lack of response and the lack of engagement from the ambassadors that are present in the room.
You also spoke at the CNN interview about, as I quote, the secular religion of human rights, which is one of the drivers of today's anti-Semitism. How are we to understand that? What is the secular religion of human rights, and how is it connected to nowadays anti-Semitism?
Yes, thank you for that question. You know, anti-Semitism has been called by the likes of Professor Westrich the oldest hatred in the world. Anti-Semitism mutates over the thousands of years of its existence. It's existed as long as the Jewish people have existed ourselves, thousands of years. The understanding that it has mutated over time by latching on to the guiding social constructs of each time, religion, science, and the secular religion of our times post-World War II, human rights. The understanding that it is that guiding social construct which is used to then, I'll say, justify the modern strain of an ever-mutating lethal hate is precisely what it was that enabled anti-Zionism, Zionism is racism, anti-Zionism to become the modern, mutated, mainstream, acceptable strain, if you will, of anti-Semitism. The understanding, and I mentioned before, that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, in a long democratic process, post-Durban, the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism, created this comprehensive definition of anti-Semitism, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, that enables to track what is an ever-mutating virus in all of its presentations. The 11 examples in IRA are critical. One is not less important than the other. The 11 examples enable us to comprehensively identify all strains of this ever-mutating virus. But the implication that the modern secular religion, or the modern strain of anti-Semitism, has latched onto the guiding social construct of our times, that is human rights, is precisely what makes this an existential moment for all of us who cherish the values of human rights. The understanding that if that guiding social construct is what legitimates this lethal hate, this modern mainstream strain that has appropriated human rights, that should concern anybody who believes in the fundamental necessity, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's what the importance of the UN having actually been appropriated in that way, in many ways signals. I'd say that anti-Semitism has historically been, in the thousands of years of its existence, the most reliable warning sign of the major threat to humanity and freedom and the dignity of difference, in the words of the late Rabbi Sachs, the former chief rabbi of the UK. That is why it should concern anybody who actually cherishes human rights. In that sense, if you've enabled the appropriation of the terminology, I mentioned some of the principles, or of the words, or of the law, or of the facts that have been appropriated and turned on their heads, including genocide, including apartheid, including racism, then you understand that if you've allowed those to be appropriated, hijacked, then they no longer are able to protect anybody. It's not just the subject of this new modern lethal strain of anti-Semitism being actually not just Jews, because in this subset, if I describe the modern strain as anti-Zionism, you need not be a Jew to be the target of it. If you believe in Israel's right to exist as an equal member in the family of nations, that's what it was intended to be. Well, you are now fair game. You are now the target of this new strain of anti-Semitism that is anti-Zionism. It's also the imperative that we actually have to underscore, especially when I sit here in Austria, that is one of the most prominent countries in not just adopting IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, but in leading with it across sectors, right? The educational, the professional, the academic, the institutional, that must actually implement the working definition of anti-Semitism if we are to comprehensively be able to identify and combat it. You can't identify something without defining it, and you certainly can't combat it without identifying it. And therefore, that definition becomes so seminal, including that it enables to identify this strain that appropriated the secular religion of our times, that is human rights.
Well, there's obviously a lot of criticism of the IRA working definition, and what amazes me every single time I hear it, is this claim that the IRA definition somehow would criminalize criticism of Israel, or would criminalize supporting Palestinian rights or whatever. I mean, if you get $1 every time you hear this claim, you'd be a rich man or woman. How is it possible to simply ignore what's basically written down verbatim in the IRA definition and just claim the opposite?
As you say, it clearly stipulates, the IRA working definition, that criticism of the state of Israel, like criticism of any other country, of course that's not anti-Semitism. That's actually how democracies thrive. And believe me, Israelis plenty criticize our government. The point is, of course, the differentiation between criticism of Israel and its delegitimization, the denial of Israel's right to exist. There is no country whose right to exist is called into question. Not Cuba, not Iran, not the United States, not Canada, not Austria. The idea that double standards work in all kinds of ways and somehow it is legitimate to delegitimize Israel's very right to exist as criticism is precisely what exposes that double standard. And it also explains the huge pushback on IRA. Those 3 Ds, and I say here in Austria, and I just said this in Germany, those 3 Ds, demonization, delegitimization, and double standards, they are the mechanism that enable the mutation of anti-Semitism. It matters not if it was used to demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standard to the individual Jew, barring them from an equal place in society, or anti-Semitism didn't die, it just mutated. You demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to the Jew among the nations that was intended to be equal, barring it from an equal place in the family of nations. And therefore that sort of, as you say, if we had $1 every time we hear it, it renders the asker, either they've never read the IRA working definition. I have no other sort of assumption that I can make. Have you read the IRA? Because it clearly stipulates that criticism is, of course, not anti-Semitism, but criticism like every other country. The Jew among the nations, just like the individual Jew, has not only the right, but the responsibility to demand to be treated equally and consistently. There is no other way of identifying this strain of anti-Semitism, the one that demonizes, delegitimizes, and applies double standards, to what was meant to be an equal member state in the family of nations, that is the Jewish nation state, that is Israel. And what it exposes is exactly the people who are asking it, pushing back on IRA. And I'll say much worse than pushing back on IRA. There are alternate definitions in today's reality that actually render not only the IRA as not relevant in the conversation, but there are new definitions. I'll give an example from Canada, a new concept called APR, anti-Palestinian racism, that essentially is defined as Zionism. If you are a Zionist, you're an anti-Palestinian racist. And if the Ontario School Board has adopted the term APR, it means that if you're a student, a parent, a teacher, a principal, anyone in the Ontario School Board, and you're a Zionist, because Zionist is integral to the identity of the majority of Jews and many non-Jews around the world, who recognize that for thousands of years, Jews yearned and prayed and longed to return to Zion, that the state of Israel is not some reparation prize for the murder of 6 million Jews, and it is not a European colonialist enterprise. It is the nation state of the Jewish people, a prototypical indigenous people. That word too has meaning. Indigenous, who speak the same language, Hebrew, who traverse the same land, Israel, who practice the same customs and rituals for thousands of years, returned after thousands of years of exile and persecution, of which the Holocaust was the most modern, recent rendition that is committed to equality. And that is just Israel's Declaration of Independence. Recognition that we have this responsibility to actually not just remember the past, but actually reclaim all that has been appropriated, including in human rights contexts, and that the IRA definition is seminal. It's the most critical resource that we have to be able to identify anti-Semitism, no matter where it comes from, and in all of its strains. The devastating piece is actually that this normalization or mainstreaming of the modern strain of anti-Semitism, we'll call it just anti-Zionism, has actually unleashed anti-Semitism in all of its previous forms or strains as well. They didn't die, the old strains. And you see in the IRA that the old strains have come right back out, unleashing, if you will, the genie from the bottle with a mainstreaming of the new strain.
I'm talking about how to understand anti-Semitism. There's a former Austrian president who recently railed against Israel, or Israel's alleged war against the people of Gaza, as he called it. And he said that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the war, quote, are not reducing anti-Semitism, but increasing it. And this must be stopped. I assume you don't agree with this view.
Not only don't I agree, I think that that is precisely what I'm trying to make accessible in the mainstreaming and normalization of this new strain of anti-Semitism. you know, if Israel just didn't exist, there wouldn't be anti-Semitism. We have to be very clear what is happening today in this multi-front war on the state of Israel, perpetrated by Hamas, a genocidal terror proxy of the Islamic regime in Iran. Meaning, the same genocidal terror proxy, Hamas, holds hostage as human sacrifices, as human shields, the people of Gaza. So I would have argued that if you care, as I do, for the rights of innocent people everywhere, including those living in Gaza, you should be ensuring and protesting to free Gaza from Hamas, a genocidal, prescribed genocidal terror organization. And I'll say the dangerous thing about this new step is actually even in places where Hamas is a designated terror organization, as opposed to others like the IRGC, not yet prescribed as a designated terror organization, and the Muslim Brotherhood, and so on, Hamas is a designated terror organization, and there are steps being taken to undesignate Hamas. So that actually, for me, exposes the danger that I try to make accessible, not just to me, not just to the state of Israel. Alongside the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism is this mainstreaming of terror. That's what we see happening basically in the same coordinated effort. The understanding that if you mainstream anti-Semitism, you will have also mainstreamed the extremities or the radical ideologies, the genocidal, very clearly, openly intent. As I said, you just have to read the Hamas charter or the Houthi logo or the Hezbollah intent or the Islamic regime in Iran's Twitter account, or X, excuse me, of the supreme leader, who almost daily threatens to precisely annihilate the state of Israel and murder Jews around the world. Now, we can close our eyes to that, but what I would argue in return to that statement is that if you care for the people of Gaza, as you understand that when the Nazis had to be fought, and there may have been, by the way, innocent civilians that were harmed in a war against the Nazis, as there was in the war against ISIS, in the war against Al-Qaeda, in the war against Daesh. If you actually apply a double standard and say to the Jews, well, Hamas is a genocidal terror organization, but you have to make peace with the organization that we're going to keep, that continue to hold Palestinians hostage, actually preventing Palestinian children from a better future in Gaza, then what we have is the human rights infrastructure or industry or values emboldening genocidal terror proxies everywhere, not just in the state of Israel. I say over and over again, anti-Semitism in many ways is just the predictor. It's just the canary in the coal mine. You can ignore it, you can look away. We have this moment in time in which we can identify what it is that has made, as I said, this never again is now moment. That instead of the response actually holding Hamas to account, but it's not just Hamas, it's the regimes that enable Hamas. Qatar, Turkey, others, of course Iran, that could have been and should have been made to return 251 people on October the 8th. Of course, Hamas, a genocidal terror proxy, cares not for international law. But those that actually are charged with or mandated with upholding international law should have held to account the countries that enable Hamas, that fuel Hamas, that fund Hamas, that house Hamas, as we would treat any other genocidal terror entity. And that's part of this sort of double standard Orwellian inverted reality, in which not only is Israel defending itself from openly declared genocidal intent, but it's doing so with the collaboration, if you will, of those that should be calling the openly declared genocidal intent of a democracy that is meant to be a member in the family of nations. Instead of being supported, it's actually seated on the dock of the accused and constantly needing to defend itself from the attack of our allies and friends.
One of the examples of this hijacking of law and international law is, of course, the International Criminal Code, which has issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant. As someone who has previously been involved with the ICC, what is your opinion of this proceeding and the issuing of arrest warrants?
Look, the devastating story of the ICC that was actually created to be a court of last resort, we have to understand, that was meant to actually deal with the most egregious atrocities in countries that have no legal mechanisms, and a court of last resort, I'll say a court of last resort with limited resources. This has been a long time coming. So when I was a member of Israel's parliament, actually, the first allegations rendered by the then prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, were rendered, or the result came in pending, and this is a continuation of the understanding that the ICC, or the International Criminal Court itself, has actually been not just politicized, but in this case, most recently, we also know, personalized. So this prosecutor using the ICC to issue those warrants, we now understand as is being exposed or as being reported, in order to be able to deflect allegations from rape. Literally whitewashing rape of the prosecutor who continues to serve as the prosecutor of the ICC. The devastation of, for me, as somebody who believes in this international rules-based order, in the necessity of the post-World War II infrastructure that was created that includes the ICC, so that never again, with the ICC itself, as I said at the time with Fatou Bensouda, completely ignoring its own foundational principles, justiciability, of complementarity. By the way, despite amicus briefs submitted by 7 countries that actually not only ensured, or at the time attested to the fact that there are no justiciability, no complementarity, those are not met, but also demanded that the ICC reform itself, with hundreds of pages of recommendations of reform, none of which, of course, have been implemented. And that means that, once again, it's almost a test case, if you will, that the weaponization of international law or its institutions, such as the ICC, collapse them, and therefore the ICC can protect no one. It no longer exists as that court of last resort.
Of course, there are these reports about the allegations against Mr. Khan, the prosecutor of the ICC, but in the end, it was not he who issued the arrest warrants, but it were the judges of the pre-trial chamber of the ICC. So he might have had his personal interest, but the blame goes somewhere else too, not only to him, but by the way, actually the judges of the
100%. You're 100% right, and of course that they rushed to issue those arrest warrants, but without even discussing the issues that they had to discuss of, do they even have the right to be able to try, if you will, something that has come to them without having, justiciability, or without Israel belonging as a member state in the Rome Statute, and without Palestine being a state. And there are all kinds of, double standards that have been applied in that case systematically. But it's a very important test case to say that when the law is hijacked and weaponized for political or personal reasons, then we understand the dangerous implications of that. I can't but remember every time that I speak about the law and its importance in terms of its equal and consistent application, and not allowing it to be hijacked and weaponized. The conference in which I was at in Berlin at the invitation of the German Justice Minister, and that began in the Lieberman Villa, where the Wannsee conference took place. And knowing theoretically that 9 of the 15 men who actually orchestrated the final solution and made the decision that, yes, ridding the world, creating a Juden-free world was what the final solution would look like, 9 of 15 of those men were lawyers. The importance of understanding, as lawyers that believe in this international rules-based order and the human rights infrastructure that was created to uphold, promote, and protect equally and consistently, becomes all that much more pronounced through that looking glass of how dangerous it is to allow the hijacking and weaponization of law and its structures, such as the ICC in this case.
There is one last topic that I have to mention, and it's somewhat delicate. There's been recently some heated debate about a conference against anti-Semitism that took place in Jerusalem at the end of March. And the reason for the heated debate was, of course, that the government, which was organized this conference, invited also representatives of some far-right parties, extreme right-wing extremist parties, some would say, to attend the conference, and they did actually attend. So people like the head of the French Rassemblement National, the former Front National, and the Sweden Democrats and other representatives of parties like that. And this was met with fierce criticism, and several of those others who were invited to the conference withdrew their participation. Here in Austria, Ariel Musikant, the former head of the Austrian Jewish community and now the president of the European Jewish Congress, wrote, I quote him, "The motivation of extreme right-wing politicians to come to this conference in Jerusalem is not love for Israel or to protect the Jews, but mainly to get a kosher rabbi stamp. And we Jews or Israelis should not be used as rabbi stamps." And he added that the conference, quote, "is a major problem for Jewish communities in Europe. It is harming the Jewish existence in the diaspora. It is as if members of the Israeli government are stabbing us in the back." What was your position on this conference and the attendance of these very problematic people and problematic allies, obviously, in the view of Mr. Musikant, for example?
Yeah, 100%. Look, it was a diaspora ministry organized conference, and the most important thing for me, actually, including as Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism, but I've touched on IRA from multiple directions. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition enables and demands to transcend real or perceived difference of geography, of religion, and of politics. That IRA working definition enables me to demand, whether it's from parties on what's the right, considered the right, the left, or any other space that they hold, to say, this is the non-legally binding working definition that you espouse to. And if you cannot agree to all of the 11 examples, the entirety, right? Not just what suits you in your political structures, then I always say the politicization of anti-Semitism actually fuels it. And so at the time, Natan Sharansky and I actually held the night before a discussion between us at the President's house and said the following: the demand must be that each and every space, if it's on the right, call out anti-Semitism on the right. If it's on the left, call out anti-Semitism on the left. If it's in Islamic domains, call out Islamism or anti-Semitism in Islamic places. And the key for me is the understanding that whether it comes from the extreme right, the extreme left, the extreme Islamist, the key word being extreme, that is what anti-Semitism has shown us for thousands of years, meaning it'll always come from the extremities. It's also why, in the words of the late Rabbi Sachs, it reliably predicts a rising threat to humanity and freedom and the dignity of difference, because that's how the extremities actually then take over the discourse or dictate the discourse for what is happening in a silent or silenced moderate majority. And I expressed my opinions very clearly at the time, and as my counterparts around the world, special envoys for combating anti-Semitism, many of them did not attend. I also did not, in fact, attend the actual conference, only, as I said the night before, engaged in conversation with Natan Sharansky at the President's in order to be able to say exactly that. Anti-Semitism must never be politicized, must never be utilized, because it is then fueling anti-Semitism, and it must be identified and combated comprehensively from whatever sort of side of the political aisle, utilizing the IRA working definition in its entirety.
So, Mrs. Kotler-Wunsch, thank you once again for taking the time to speak with us. Let's hope and do everything in our power to ensure that better times will soon arrive, and hope we'll have the opportunity to talk with other again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll just say one more thing, if I may. I think that each and every individual has a very important role at this moment in time in standing up and speaking out. I think I often say courage is contagious, and you'd be surprised how many people actually are perhaps afraid, perhaps silent, perhaps indifferent, but actually recognizing that if indeed this anti-Semitism predicts what is an existential threat to all of our spaces and places, and that the foundations of democracies that we so cherish have to actually be protected. Freedom is not free, as I always say. Then this is a moment to speak up with moral clarity and with courage that hopefully will inspire others to do so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.